I had the opportunity this past week of going to a middle school girls volleyball game. Interesting to watch these young ones go from not even being able to hit a ball or throw a ball to actually playing volleyball is quite something. They've developed that way, but something else has also developed. They can scream. Middle school girls, I believe if you put them next to a patrol car and had them scream and the siren go, they would be louder than the siren. If we hadn't been in a gym, I'm not sure how far people would have heard what was going on. It distracts whatever else is going on and gets the attention toward that noise. Well, we have that very thing with these two guys sitting on the side of the road here, as Matthew records it in chapter 20, verse 29 and following. They called out. They ultimately ended up screaming out to Jesus. Let me tell you something. Jesus was not disturbed by that. He is pleased when we call out to him. So I want us to see what we can learn from the flow of this encounter these two blind guys had with Jesus. And we begin with the herd. Verse 29 of Matthew 20 says, as Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd, I call them the herd, followed him. Now, Jesus was used to crowds. They were small at the beginning of his ministry, but now in the third year of his earthly ministry, they were huge at times. This mention of crowd follows 40 other mentions of crowd before Matthew chapter 20, just in the book of Matthew. Let me give you an example. If you want these references, I'll give them to you later. But in Matthew 4, just crowds from all these different cities followed him. Matthew 7, the crowds, were amazed at his teaching. Matthew 9, they were filled with awe and praised God. Matthew 9, later on, they were noisy. Matthew 9, later on, they were harassed and helpless, Jesus thought, like sheep without a shepherd. The crowds got so large by Matthew 13, Jesus left them on the shore, got in a boat, and stood in the boat out in the water so that he could teach and speak to them. At one time, Matthew 14, he fed 5,000 men, not counting women and children, miraculously. And another time, 4,000 men, not counting women and children. Those crowds could have been 15,000, 20,000 people right there. Matthew 15 says he healed them. Now, in the near future, after the passage we're looking at, people are going to spread their cloaks on the road and cut branches from trees and wave them as he makes a royal entrance into Jerusalem before the final days of his earthly life. In Matthew 21, we catch the crowd shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And they were telling people he was a prophet from Nazareth in Matthew 21. They caused so much fear among the religious rulers of that day. The rulers were trying to catch Jesus at something in order to get rid of him, but they were afraid of the crowds. And then in Matthew 27, members of that same crowd called out for Jesus to be crucified and Barabbas to be freed. Imagine that, the crowd that went through all of that now turning against him. Well, crowds are fickle, to say the least. They often follow, and especially at this time with Jesus doing miracles, they often follow the entertainment factor. And it was quite entertaining to see all of these lame people and crippled people and all being made whole again. A crowd that size is not optimum for teaching, though. Jesus would take his 12 disciples aside and teach them privately, or Peter, James, and John, the inner three, and teach them privately. But crowds do have a mentality of their own, and it's usually called a mob mentality. And as quickly as they come, they leave. Nevertheless, the crowd is integral to the account of these two men. I call them the herd. And now the helpless. Matthew 20, verse 30. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside. Now, in ancient time, blind people and other people with different infirmities that wouldn't allow them to work were just consigned to be beggars somewhere. They would sit on roads near the temple or near big cities where there was high traffic at the chance of getting more given to them at those places. Jericho was a city where wealthy people lived, and so a popular location for beggars like these 2 men. There was no medical help that could cure these guys. It was not available for their problem or other problems. People tended to ignore, Jewish people tended to ignore their spiritual obligations toward helping these people as set out in the book of Leviticus of the Old Testament. So the beggars had little hope of escaping a life of sitting on the side of a road begging people for subsistence. They were helpless. But here's the hearsay that comes. Verse 30 of Matthew 20. They heard that Jesus was going by. Now I imagine, this is my imagination, these guys heard a lot of things sitting on the side of the road. People were discussing, they may have been the most well-informed people of anybody in town because they heard the discussions that were going on, probably private things too. As the people walked or rode donkeys by, if the guy can't see you, then you think they can't hear you either, but that's not the case. But the news of Jesus, they heard a lot of depressing things, but the news of Jesus brought hope for them. They heard he was coming. That's the hearsay. So, as he's coming, the heralding starts by these 2. Verse 30 says, they shouted, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Now we need to realize that those few words are a prayer. It's a prayer. It's equivalent to what people have been crying out for centuries. It's what I call an emergency prayer. Here it is. Jesus, I need your help. Jesus, I need your help now. Jesus, I'm recognizing you as Lord. And in this case, I'm recognizing you as a descendant of King David, which is very important to the Jewish people. So in these few words, you have recognition of who Jesus is, and you have a request built in there. That's the initial heralding that they did. They yelled out. Then comes the hushing. Verse 31 says, the crowd rebuked them and told them to shut up, to be quiet. Why? Why would you do that? They've just recognized who Jesus was and made a request of him, and now the crowd is rebuking them. Did the crowd want all the miracles for themselves? Did the crowd really respect Jesus' privacy and leadership that much that they didn't want him interrupted? It's really odd that they would hush these guys up because many in the crowd had done the same thing. Maybe they had found a good thing and they didn't want to share it with the lowlife, with the imperfect, with the worthless. Thus, the hush. So, the hollering starts. We're going from heralding, which is classical and well-mannered, and now the hollering starts. It's like the middle school girls, I think. Verse 31 says, they shouted all the louder. Same message, same prayer. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. The attempt to shut them up was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It did not work. They obviously knew the reputation of Jesus from sitting on the side of the road and listening. They had heard a lot about him, and they were not about to be silenced. This was their only chance. Their heralding evolved into hollering. And I can imagine it was uncontrollable once they got started. And then Jesus showed them hospitality. Verse 32, Jesus stopped and called them. What do you want me to do for you, he asked. Interpreted, that would mean, what mercy are you asking for or requesting? You see, Jesus was kind and compassionate. He knew when there was a genuine need. The question he asked to us seems to have an obvious answer. The guys want to see, but I think he wanted them to be specific, to tell him personally what they wanted, and thus comes the hope. In verse 33, Lord, they answered, we want our sight. Now remember this. By this time in Scripture, in the book of Matthew, just Matthew, because you can put the Synoptic Gospels and John together like this, and a whole bunch of things are in one that aren't in the other biography of Jesus. But by this time in Matthew, Jesus had healed the man with leprosy, the Roman centurion's servant, Peter's mother-in-law, the demon-possessed men among the tombs, the paralyzed man, the woman with bleeding, 2 other blind men, the mute man, the man with the shriveled hand, the man who was blind, mute, and demon-possessed, the Canaanite woman's daughter, the boy with the demon. He had also calmed a storm, walked on water, fed the 5,000 plus, and fed the 4,000 plus, and he had raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. The 2 men had hope because they knew about Jesus. They had heard people talking about what he had done. And then comes the actual healing. Verse 34, Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight. 4 times in the Gospel of Matthew, the word compassion is used. It's always used as referring to Jesus, not to anybody else around. 4 times, always reflecting his action. So now they're healed. There's one that's the most important thing coming up. I call it the henceforth. The most important. How were the lives of these men affected? Verse 34 says, immediately they followed him. They were immediately healed, but immediately they followed him. Immediate miracle, immediate decision of who to follow. I don't think they became just a part of the crowd. The crowd had been so mean, so offensive, and so uncaring to them. And they may have known too much about the crowd to really align with them, but they followed Jesus. Their lives were changed forever. We will sing today, we sang last Sunday, a hymn called Amazing Grace that says at the end of it, I once was blind, but now I see. So true of these 2 men. And for all of us who are followers of Christ, we may not have been physically blind, but we were spiritually blind. And those of us who follow Christ as these men did have experienced Christ's compassion. And now we see spiritually. One of my favorite artists of all time, I think one of the most talented guys of all time, is Michelangelo, an Italian Renaissance artist. He happened to be near some people looking at one of his sculptures. If you've ever seen the Pietà, it's where Mary is holding the crucified body of Jesus on her lap. It is just absolutely moving and gorgeous and just perfect. Well, people were looking at it, and someone accredited that sculpture to some other artist, not him. He didn't say anything, but it upset him because that was his favorite work, his pride and joy. So that night after dark, he went and carved his name on it so that people would know whose it was. The miracle of going from spiritual blindness to spiritual sight is only the work of God, the Father, his Son, and his Spirit. Therefore, like Michelangelo carved his name on that sculpture, God's mark is on us. We need to make sure that we are doing things immediately with Christ, that we're always following him in everything. No hesitation. This is what he said. This is what I'm going to do. Well, this will happen to you. Okay, this is what he said. This is what I'm going to do. I can't do anything else because I can see spiritually now. And if you do something to me that's terminal, guess what? I'm going to see spiritual then too. It only gets better. You know, I don't want to kick the bucket, but it only gets better for those of us who follow Christ. If you have questions about this teaching, I'd love to talk with you. on the phone or in person. We can have a cup of coffee and talk about it, because it's so important that we understand seeing spiritually, because when we see spiritually, it changes what we see physically and the needs of people, like these two men sitting on the side of the road.